Hello, welcome along to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. This week, chatting to Alex Michaelides. Started as a screenwriter, wrote a few movies, decided it wasn't for him, and then published his first novel, The Silent Patient, which was successful with a massive capital S. It was the first UK debut ever to go straight to #1 on the New York Times Bestseller list. And he's followed it up with The Maidens. Now, we talk about how he discovered that he's a novelist, not a dramatist. Also, how he plots and plans his 3 acts. And what he did when things weren't going so well. How did he carry on?
So I tried to shut out all of the other voices and the expectations and just write a thriller for myself again. And I really think that's the only way that you can write. I don't think you can really write for other people. I think you have to write to try and please yourself. And I'm quite a harsh critic of my own work. So if I feel fairly happy with it, I feel like I always say The Silent Patient was the first thing I ever read that didn't make me want to throw up. And so I knew that there's something about it was working. Because generally, whenever I write something, I just feel it's awful. And so it took a long time to get there.
There is more with Alex Michaelides in this week's Writer's Routine. Yes, welcome along, it's Writer's Routine, where we take a look inside the working day of some of the most successful authors around, and we're living up to that today. Just to try and pinch a few tips and techniques from how they get stuff done, and hope we can do that too. Now, just before we get started, a little bit of admin. I'm going to take a few weeks off. It's been a very busy couple of years doing this. I think we've missed one over Christmas, maybe in 18 or so months, and now we do the bite-sized random routine as well that's earlier on in the week, most weeks, not this week. And I don't feel I need to justify everything. It's just I've got a very busy few weeks all over the place, and I don't want to keep you hanging on wondering if there's going to be an episode, and maybe I end up putting out one that's not of the quality that really I'd like. So I thought, just to make it clear, I'd have a couple of weeks off, and the next episode will be up on the 30th of September, fingers crossed. Now, this week, I've got a fantastic chat to leave you with for a while. Before we take a little sojourn, I'll leave you with Alex Michaelides. He started as a screenwriter, went to Hollywood, wrote movies for Jennifer Lawrence, Uma Thurman, and then he fell out of love with it. So he returned to the UK, worked in a therapeutic community, and got an idea for a fiction novel. That became The Silent Patient, his debut. It was a huge success. As I mentioned, it was the first ever UK debut to go straight to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. It was the second most sold fiction book on Amazon in 2019. They named it their #1 thriller of the year. It was shortlisted for a whole heap of awards. It sold 1 million copies, and then he had to write the next one. How do you follow that success? I mean, what pressure? It's called The Maidens. It's about an exclusive set of students at university, the sinister influence of the professor there, and a murder that he knows a lot more about than he's letting on. We talk about meditation, how that plays a big role in his writing day. Also, why he knocked drinking on the head. I mean, it wasn't a problem. He just felt that maybe for some things he should quit, and also when he starts again. It's very interesting. At specific points in the writing process, he will abstain and then go for it. Also, you can hear why he enjoys being the detective, why he thinks he has a first act problem. And we start, as we always do, with what Alex Michaelides sees around him in the place where he sits down to write.
I don't see much, to be honest with you. I tend to write at my kitchen table. I read somewhere years ago, I think it was on Writing by Stephen King, that he recommended writing in a room with no window. And I don't know if that works for everybody, but it certainly works for me. So I sit at the kitchen table and I face a wall. So nothing to look out of. And also my internet doesn't work in the kitchen either. So I'm pretty much just me and the laptop.
It's interesting, the Stephen King connection. Had you read that before and you thought, oh, that might be a good tip? Or is it just one of these serendipitous things that it ended up happening that way?
No, it was just a coincidence. I mean, I've always liked writing at the kitchen table. I was thinking about it the other day. And when I was a kid, I would sit at our kitchen table at home and I would do my homework. And my mum would be often be in the kitchen and I would do my English essays or whatever. And then she would often be very distracted, but I would occasionally read her an essay that I'd written about a book or something. And if it was interesting or good, I could always tell because she'd stop what she was doing and she'd listen. And so I do think, on a kind of an unconscious level, I think I'm still trying to get my mother's attention at the kitchen table.
So how have you personalised it though? A kitchen can be quite a generic space. It's a place really solely for chopping and cleaning and cooking. I know that some writers like to they like to inhabit their place, make it theirs, make it a cocoon. What have you got around you, maybe on the kitchen desk that you have, just to remind you what you're there to do?
Well, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I bought the table specifically years ago because I wanted to have a wooden table. I like having a kind of rectangular wooden table to sit on. And I tend to have my notes with me. It's always, I get a little ritualistic about being tidy around. I'm not a very tidy person, but in order to write and think, I really think you need to have order around you. And so I usually start by tidying up a little bit, and then I have my notes on one side, which are always handwritten. And I then I grind some coffee beans and have a little pot of coffee and a little cup and saucer. And I always burn some incense as well. And then I start.
Well, let me drop you into what might be a nightmare for you. What if you were to write in a very cluttered environment? How would that impact the way that you told stories?
I think that would affect my mind in a kind of chaotic way. I think I would find it very hard to focus. I think I'm very strict about that. I need kind of tidiness around me. I don't think I'm unique in that. I think I can't remember it now, but I grew up in Cyprus, and there is definitely an ancient Greek saying about that very thing, that you need to have an ordered room in order to have an ordered mind.
And now you've got your notes around you. Sorry to get what might be quite niche, but what are you writing on? Is it a laptop? What is it? A specialized software? And also, Alex, very quickly, have you got any strong font opinions?
I've never been asked such detailed questions before. It's fantastic. I write on a laptop. When I was a screenwriter, I used to write on Final Draft, but I don't anymore. I now write on just Microsoft Word, and I write in Times New Roman. But you know what? Sometimes I do find myself changing the font, because I think if you stare at the same font all the time, you can get a little blind to things. And so it's good to be able to freshen up what you're seeing.
How do you know when the time's right to freshen up what you're seeing? What's the cue to change your font?
Sometimes I just get really stuck, or I just feel I cannot continue because I just want to jump out of the window, and I think, okay, well, at least I'll try. At least I'll have a different font to kind of encourage me to keep going. It doesn't last long. I always kind of go back to Times New Roman again. Well, I get up and I usually don't have breakfast. I have a lot of coffee during the day. So I start with a couple of coffees, and then I go to the gym. And then I come back. And then I think the only really interesting or relevant part is the meditation, which is a huge part of my life. And I meditate. I try and meditate, once or twice a day. But when I'm writing, I tend to meditate 3 times a day. And this started with my first novel, The Silent Patient, because I just made myself this promise that I would be entirely sober for the whole writing period. I I never drink before writing, but I would be sober all day and all night. And I would also meditate before I wrote a word. And I've stuck to that with the second novel, The Maidens. I just think, it's not everybody works in different ways, but I find that if I meditate, once or twice before sitting down, my mind is clear, and I'm able to kind of dive underneath any anxious or negative or critical thoughts that I have. They still occur, but after you've meditated, somehow you're able just to kind of park them to one side and continue writing. Whereas I think if I didn't meditate, I would get really crippled by these self-critical thoughts, which are pretty relentless. So I do that, and then I write. Can I quickly?
Oh, sorry, Alex. Can I quickly cut in just to ask a question about the decision to knock drinking on the head while you're writing? So many famous writing routines are based around drinking. With Hemingway and stuff like that. It's I think sometimes a thing that people put 2 and 2 together: creativity with this need to drink when you can. What made the decision for you to say, okay, when I am writing, I will abstain?
Well, there's a few things going on there. I mean, what I'd like to come back to maybe a bit later on in the chat is about editing, because I do drink when I edit, but that's a different process for me. But the actual writing, of the book, the first draft, I'm always sober for, because, I'm really into Tennessee Williams and Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and I've read an awful lot about them, including their own writings about their own writing, if you know what I mean. And, Fitzgerald is the first to say he wished he'd been sober for a lot of it, but he wasn't. Hemingway says that you can drink after writing, but never during writing. And Tennessee Williams, bless him, I mean, he's probably my favorite. And what began with a glass of wine in a very ritualistic way ended up being several bottles of wine. And then the writing got worse and worse and worse. And I personally found that if I am sober, if I've had a heavy night boozing, the next day the words don't come and they're messy. And also I can't really focus when I meditate. But there's also something else going on too, because I think alcohol deadens your subconscious. And so what I found is when I don't drink, say for 6 weeks while I'm writing the first draft, I go to bed thinking about the book. I'm dreaming. On some level, my mind is working, and I wake up thinking about the book. Whereas if you get smashed, you don't think about anything. You just kind of barely function. And so there's something about really being in touch with my unconscious or subconscious that I find very important, because it comes from wanting to do my absolute best job, because the first novel I thought it would be the only novel I would write. It took me 20 years to get down to it. And so when I finally sat down to write, I thought this has to be absolutely my best job. And for the second novel, I felt that I had to, the worst thing for me would be to write a second novel that was a disaster and then blame myself because I'd been drunk through it. So, I thought, okay, I've got to show up. And so, even if the novel is no good, I don't really know. It's hard to judge one's own writing. I know that I did my absolute best and I showed up for it every day. So at least I have that to hold on to.
But a very good answer. Now you've meditated. What time are we through the day, and when are you going to sit down and start typing?
Usually start around 12, and I usually work until about 6. But I break every hour to just either to meditate again for 10 minutes or so, or to have some tea. I switch from coffee to tea because too much coffee, I start jumping around. And then I go 6, and then what I tend to do, this thing I'm trying to write right now is work until 6, and then I go for a long walk on Hampstead Heath. And then it's funny because that frees you up. Like Dickens obviously would walk a lot. And when I was working in a psychiatric unit, one of the psychiatrists always used to say to the patients there, move a muscle to change a thought. And there's something about the actual physical movement of walking that frees me up a lot. And so I get lots of good ideas while I'm walking, and then hurry home and then jot them down for the next day.
So what constitutes a good day for you, Alex? If you're getting, 6 good hours writing there, give or take a break every now and then, what are you happy with getting done when you go for your walk? I
take it really easy because, I think it's really being able to write for a living and being paid to write is such a joy for me. And I come from a screenplay world where I had a kind of what I call a pretty unsuccessful career, in that I had 3 films that were each worse than the last. And it ended up being a bit of a chaotic, frenetic experience. And so when I write the novels, I really, really slow down. So I only do like 1 chapter a day, maybe 2. With first draft, 1 chapter a day, second draft, probably 2 or 3 chapters a day. But 1 chapter is, for me, usually anywhere between 3 and 6 pages, single spaced. And that's it. But I'm happy with 3 pages if it's a chapter. I write very short chapters because I have a very short attention span.
How relentlessly are you going at it? Are you pretty fastidious in working 5 or even 7 days a week?
It's usually 6 days a week, but even on the 7th day, you keep going. When I studied screenwriting at the American Film Institute in Los Angeles, and I had a really wonderful teacher there called Alan Estrin, who was a Disney writer. And he always said, once you get in the river, you've got to stay in the river, and I think it's really, that's always stayed with me. I don't think you can take 2 or 3 day breaks between when you're writing the first draft, because you just lose that flow.
Now, in those 6 hours, you seem to have worked it well. So when you do have maybe a dip in energy, you can take yourself away, you can meditate, you can refocus. Is there anything else though, Alex, that maybe just helps those juices go, helps the words come out when you are struggling? I know you like your coffee, maybe a coffee at a certain time, maybe a little bit of music on in the background?
Yeah, I have classical music. I tend to listen to the same kind of thing again and again. It's like it's almost like white noise. So I listen to the same kind of soundtracks. So I wrote the Maidens to the soundtrack of The Hours, and that's all I listened to for a year or so while I was writing that. So it's sort of, you stop hearing it after a while, and it just becomes a way of blocking something out. I'm not quite sure how it works, but I find it very helpful.
And you mentioned editing just a second ago, and you will drink when you edit. I'm not sure if that's because of the state of the draft or something, that you just need anything to get you through. I guess it's quite an open thing talking about editing, because so many authors do it in so many different ways with so many different drafts. But just how, when you've finished your first draft, how long will you leave it? When will you come back to it? Is there a process to how you approach redrafting?
I'd like to leave it as long as possible. I think what I've done with both novels is, again, following Stephen King's advice of, he says 6 weeks minimum. And I did that with The Silent Patient. With the Maidens, I was more time precious, so I wasn't able quite to do that. But I definitely left it about 3 weeks before picking it up again after the first draft. Then what I tend to do is print it out and read it over a period of like 4 days. Again, I don't rush it, because I think the moment it turns into a chore for me, I just get really turned off and I just don't want to do it anymore. So I have to take it in small chunks. And then that's my favorite part of it. My agent always laughs when I say this, but it's true, because I allow myself to drink during the day, and I have tequila. And I sit down with some tequila and my first draft and read through it. And there's something about having a little alcohol at that point which puts me on a different creative plane. I wouldn't be able to write sentences or good sentences, but what I can do then is maybe it relaxes me, and it allows me to see thematic links that maybe I were missing before, or little ideas or images. And so I'm able to jot notes down all the way through. And also it allows you to be brutal about stuff that's really bad. So I just cross out whole pages and stuff like that. Whereas if I were sober and looking at it, I might be a little more attached to it. But I only do that once. And then I proceed to type up all of the changes that are written in pencil. I type them up onto the document. And then I just do that process again and again and again. I don't use alcohol again after that, but I then use coffee, and I print it out and then read it again and make more changes. And I do this endlessly until, when I was writing The Silent Patient, it was really funny, because it really freaked me out, because when I finally had the finished book, I printed it out, read it, and then I had a million corrections, typed them up, read it again, had even more corrections. And I kept this up for it was almost about a year. And I just thought, oh my God, this is never going to stop, because they weren't getting less. They were just getting different, the changes. And I thought I was driving myself mad. And then it's very, very quickly, suddenly at the end of a year, they got fewer and fewer and fewer, the changes that I was making. And then finally, I read it through in one go, and I had no corrections. And then I thought, okay, now it's ready. But it took many, many drafts to get there. This is an organic process that has come to me over many years of writing. So I discovered that the best way that I work is this. And I had experience working on movies before with directors who always insisted on drinking. And I found that what you think is amazing when you're drunk is no good when you're sober. So it scared me. And that's how I got into the whole idea of being sober for the writing. I don't know the way that it works. It's just something that kind of grew organically, really. And so I'm really happy with it now, because it works for me. But it has taken a long time to kind of get to this place. But, we haven't spoken much about planning, but that's the biggest part for me, is the outlining. So when I was at the AFI, my tutor had always said to us, don't do endless drafts of screenplays. He said it's a waste of time. He said just do endless drafts of your outline instead. And so I tend to do that for, I would say, 6 months to a year before I even think about writing a page of prose. I just go over the outline again and again and again and again, trying to make it better.
Well, I promise we will come to that in a bit more detail. But that does lead to one more question about the day. When you sit there at 12 o'clock, how much do you know about the scenes that you're hoping to get done before 6?
Everything. I know everything about them. I don't leave much to chance. I know I mean, we can talk more about the actual nuts and bolts of it, but I know what's going to happen in the scene and what I need to accomplish in the scene and what the beats are in the scene or the chapter. What I don't know is the dialogue. And that's why the meditating really helps, because I get into a very present moment space where I just type and the characters seem to talk to each other. And I think because I'm so meticulous is a nice word, controlled is the word I'd use probably about everything else, that therefore I allow myself freedom with the dialogue, and then that comes out in a fresh way. But apart from that, everything else is pretty mapped out.
What form does that mapping take, Alex? Is there a big spreadsheet somewhere? Is it meticulous notes in your book?
Well, it starts off with there's different stages, but it ends up with an outline that's chapter by chapter, that's written down, usually in pencil, next to me.
And sorry, just what would, I know you can't give too much away, but what would one of those chapter outlines look like? Like, how thorough are the notes that you're giving yourself?
They're pretty thorough. I mean, it's about, I think about it in terms of, the way that I was trained. It's really, it's interesting because I studied screenwriting, and so I feel very fortunate that I had a really excellent teacher who taught me a method, I think, of writing but although I don't think I was very good at writing screenplays, the method transposes really well to novels, I think, or to any kind of drama, and that's basically, motivation and tension and goal, what do you want? Why do you want it? And how are you going to get it? And you have to kind of put that into every scene. So in every scene, to avoid it being completely passive or flat, my heroine, in this case, Mariana, wants something in each scene. And so I identify what that is, and then I think about how she's going to get it, and I think about obstacles that she's going to face, and then I think about the little twist at the end of the chapter, which propels you to the next chapter. And that's what I mean about planning. So to come up with that for 60-odd chapters takes a very long time, and you have to really think about it carefully. But I eventually have that in front of me, yeah. And I also have notes about, atmosphere. I taught myself to write novels by obsessively reading Angela Carter, who I just love, and she's always about smells and sounds and colors, and it's all this kind of very sensory stuff, which I think really helps give a kind of texture to the novel.
We will unpack the way that you plot in just a sec. It's interesting that you say, with the hint of modesty, I don't think I was a great screenwriter. But then again, I mean, that might be the case for films, but it's interesting that your first, The Silent Patient was the first ever UK debut to go straight to number one on the New York Times. I mean, it sold a whole bunch of books. Why do you think you can write novels, whereas you're critical of the way you write screenplays?
Because, so a friend of mine is a critic, and he said something that I thought was so brilliant. He said to me two things when he read The Silent Patient. He said, "It's very clear to me now that you are a novelist and not a dramatist." And by that, he meant that I don't think I'm very good at staging scenes, but the discovery that I could go inside someone's head was really incredible for me. And that changed everything. And that's why I love novels, because you can access a real depth. And I was never quite able to do that, I think, with a screenplay. And also, he said that novels are about expansion, whereas screenplays are about contraction, which I think is so brilliant, because it's true. And what I learned from screenplay writing is this kind of drive to get the story moving, keep it going, get it, so it doesn't ever stop. But in a novel, you can really slow down, and you can slow down time, and you can go for a walk with the character and be inside her head while she thinks about her childhood. And you certainly couldn't do that in a screenplay, or not quite in the same way. So that's why I think I'm better at novels. I'm just better at doing that, I think.
When you sat down to write The Silent Patient, how much did you think about the differences in writing screenplays and novels, the difference between expansion and contraction? Did that enter into your brain at all?
Yeah, it did. I was trying to, for the two things happening. I mean, I had a really formative experience where I was really fortunate to, the last film I did was was really bad. It was one of those films that had two titles, which gives you a sense of how terrible it was. And it was a complete disaster, the shoot. But the actress Uma Thurman was playing the lead, and we ended up becoming very close friends. And we were just stuck on this shoot that was happening in London, New York, and Los Angeles for months that kept going on and on. It was such an awful experience. And I told her about this novel that I was writing, and she gave me a lot of advice because there's nothing that she doesn't know about filmmaking, having been starring in films since she was 15 and working with incredible directors and being a genius herself. Really, she's one of the smartest people I've ever met. And then she sat me down with my screenplay that I had written, this comedy that we were filming, and she just explained to me what would work and what wouldn't work and why some of the scenes weren't working. And it was all about finding she says, Uma always says that every scene, and I've taken this on to every chapter, has to be an attempt at an iconic image. And so she said, you can't just have two people just talking endlessly or three people talking. You have to find a visual way of representing what is the essence of the scene. And that came to me through props and through images. And so when I sat down to write The Silent Patient, I took all of Uma's advice on board, and it made it into a much, much, much better novel.
Now, I don't want to labour too much on a negative, because we're here to talk about the Maidens and, the overwhelming success of The Silent Patient. However, just because I've got you and because you're being fairly candid about it, what's it like writing, a Hollywood film over in the States, which is, something that many people dream but never get to, and feeling that, oh, hang on, maybe I'm not quite, maybe this isn't where my skills lie, maybe this isn't going well. And then, as you said, the shoot was a disaster. You could feel it crumbling around you. Just what was that like?
Well, it's heartbreaking, and this is kind of a writer's interview. It's particularly poignant for a writer because you're the least important person on a film set. And when things go wrong, and they always do go wrong, the first thing to get thrown out is a screenplay. And so you see something that you spent years, in this case, writing and revising, being torn apart and rewritten in 15 minutes, often by somebody else. And it was absolutely devastating. And it happened to me 3 times in a row. And so I just thought these finished films bore no resemblance whatsoever to my initial screenplay. And so I just thought I have to, before I give up, it propelled me to try and write something where I would not be rewritten, I would not be edited, and I would not be kind of disregarded. And the only way that I knew how to do that was a novel. And so in a way, it was the best thing that ever happened to me, because it pushed me into what I should be doing, which was writing novels.
We're back with more from Alex Michaelides in just a sec. Very quickly, just popping up to say thank you if you've supported us on Patreon. There's still plenty of chances for you to do that. Every month you can support us and pledge whatever you like. Just a few dollars a month. It really helps us keep going. For that, as well as saying thanks for these interviews with the best authors around that we bring you more or less every week. You get merch, you get more bonus episodes. There is also a way for your books to sponsor the show. Thank you so much if you've done it already. If you've not, why don't you give it a shot for a few months? Just $1 or so a month, whatever you can spare. American podcasts, they insist on saying the price of a cup of coffee. I won't do the accent, but it goes an extraordinarily long way. I really do promise that. And you can get involved if you'd like to help us out over at patreon.com/writers routine. Right, let's get back to it then with Alex Michaelides talking about his brand new novel, The Maidens. In this half, we talk about the book, how he plans the 3 acts, why he thinks he struggles with the first as well, also how he mind maps and when he mind maps, and why he enjoys being the detective. And we get back to it with just a bit more about why he writes, I reckon, particularly with the Silent Patient that launched him to success, how it came to him when he was at quite a low ebb, and then why he pushed through.
When I wrote The Silent Patient, it was a bad place, as I've said, but it was even more difficult because I had been dropped by my agent at that point, so I didn't even have an agent, and I had no expectation that I would ever get the book published. And I wrote it as an exercise to prove to myself that I could or could not write. And I wrote it as a love letter to the genre. So, when I grew up in Cyprus, I obsessively read thrillers on the beach, starting with Agatha Christie when I was very young, and they were the first adult books that I ever read. And I remember very clearly being on the beach one summer and just devouring all of her works and thinking, one day I'm going to write a book like this. I'm going to write a detective story with a great twist at the end. And that stayed with me. And that was the only kind of book I ever wanted to write, to see if I could do it, because I feel like I've internalized those kinds of novels. And I wanted to see if I could pull one out myself. So when The Silent Patient was successful, I won't lie, it was to some degree overwhelming and a little scary. But all I could do was kind of go back to that boy on the beach and write another book for him to read. And so I tried to shut out all of the other voices and the expectations and just write a thriller for myself again. And I really think that's the only way that you can write. I don't think you can really write for other people. I think you have to write to try and please yourself. And I'm quite a harsh critic of my own work. So if I feel fairly happy with it, I feel like I always say The Silent Patient was the first thing I ever read that didn't make me want to throw up. And so I knew that there's something about it was working, because generally whenever I write something, I just feel it's awful. And so it took a long time to get there. Yeah.
So then you need to get the second book down. Talk to us about the very first moment, Alex, the idea for the Maidens came into your head.
Well, I knew the genre. That's the only thing I'd ever want to write is the genre of a detective story, or psychological detective story, or thriller as they're called nowadays. There's something about that structure that I really love. The crime, investigation, solution, it can hold so much. And it's such a great holding space and a container for all kinds of other thoughts and feelings and ideas, So I had that to start with. And then I had the idea that I would like to, again, I went back to Christie. Her novels always take place in an, iconic enclosed location. Obviously there's so many, we don't even need to list the examples. There's so many of them, a train, an isolated house, an island, et cetera, et cetera. And, so when I was working in a psychiatric unit, I thought, this is years before, I thought, this would be a great place for a thriller, because it's enclosed and it's kind of haunting. And so when I finished Silent Patient, I thought, okay, well, what other locations do I know about? And I thought, well, I'd studied at Cambridge 20 years ago. And I thought, Cambridge College could be kind of cool. And once again, Christie hadn't done the psychiatric unit, and she'd never been to university, so she didn't write the Cambridge College idea either. And I thought that I knew a little bit about that world. So I thought it would be a fun, mysterious world to start with. So I had that. And then the heroine came to me. I just had this idea, the way that these things come to you in a dreamlike way. You don't quite know why, but I had this idea of this very sad, broken-hearted woman going through her dead husband's belongings. It was the first image that came to me. And that's the first chapter in the novel. And it kind of just grew from there, really.
So, and now we get to the plotting that I'm keen to hear about. So you say it grew from there. That's a bit too vague, I'm afraid. So you've got this idea about this lonely woman. You're going to set it in Cambridge, and you described earlier that the plotting is 2/3 of the battle. That's what takes the time. How do you start? What's the very first do when you begin plotting?
Gosh, these are really tough questions. Okay,
I'm sorry.
Trying to think. What do I do? I start, I suppose, with the crime and the twist, the idea of where I want to get to. I think you need to know where you're going. Particularly in the kind of novel that I write, I think about them very much as being based on the architecture. And I think that they are like magic tricks. And so you have to get the reader to look in the wrong direction and look at the wrong thing. And so you're trying to tell two stories at once, really. I think you're trying to write the detective story, which is the apparent obvious story. And then you try and write the murderer story, which is the secret hidden story of the novel. And that goes underneath. So these two stories run in parallel. And then it's about kind of linking them together and finding a detection element to it. And that's why I like the structure, because at the very least, you have to have a crime, and then you have to have an investigation. And the investigation is the part that I enjoy, where you kind of, you are a detective and you're interviewing people, looking for clues, trying to understand and work things out. And so the way that I do it is I have, I think it's called mind mapping. I'm not sure where I read about it or how I picked it up, but I do it for everything now. So what I tend to do is I just tend to kind of sellotape together like loads of huge pieces of paper. And then I start in the middle with a point like, I don't know, a murder, a body is found. And then you kind of draw a line, and then the other point that occurs to you. I do it very free form, so I don't think about it in a structured way. Something occurs to me, so I draw a line and then write it down, and then another idea occurs to me, so I link it with another line and then another piece of writing, and it expands like this huge, ginormous cobweb. And the reason I think it works is because when I used to plot things in a list, in a linear form, I found it very inhibiting for my imagination. But when you're kind of writing and drawing arrows all over the place and writing upside down and being in different directions, you can't hold the whole thing in your head. And so you're much more freed up. And once I've done that, and it takes a long time to do that, and then the tricky bit is to then sit down with the computer and try and put all of this into some order where I type it all up, and then it's a linear list. And then you have then you're left with some kind of vague sense of a plot, a vague movement. And then onto that, I try and, I don't think too much about 3-act structure, but it's definitely imposed on me from learning to be a screenwriter where, there's various ways the first beat I try to get to is the end of Act 1. And my writing teacher at the AFI gave me the best definition of the end of Act 1 beat that I've ever heard, which is he says that when you're going to pitch it to somebody, the first thing that comes out of your mouth is generally the end of Act 1. So in this case, there's a murder in Cambridge. That kind of, there's always a detective going to investigate the crime, or something like that. You kind of lead to that point, and that's your end of Act 1 beat. And then you kind of get all the way to the end of Act 2 beat, which is when everything goes wrong and the detective's, pretty much left for dead and it's all over, it's a disaster. And then it leads you to Act 3, which is the resolution, the climax, the twist. And so you have a very kind of vague shape. Which again, I go over it again and again and again and again, and layer. But as I said earlier, Uma's the thing that really changed me was Uma's advice about props and visual stuff. Because so now what I do is I also studied a lot of Billy Wilder when I was trying to teach myself to write, and would watch his films. And because he came from silent cinema, there's nothing. He in one of his interviews and with Cameron Crowe, he said that you must never communicate a plot point through dialogue. You can do it through dialogue, but you also have to have a visual image to it. So if you turn the sound down, you can still tell what the story is. And he's a master at that, be it a cracked flower or I'll give you a really good example. In Love in the Afternoon, Maurice Chevalier discovers that his daughter, Audrey Hepburn, is in love. And how does he do that? If I were writing it, I would try and do it through dialogue, and then that would be wrong. He has him open the refrigerator, and he sees that she's keeping a little rose alive in a half a glass of water. And then he looks through the door, and he sees her, and she's sort of humming to herself as she's taking out her cello. And he smiles, and he gets it, and we get it. And so what I tend to do while I'm writing is layer all of that onto the novel. And so I try to find a prop to express the beat of every scene, which then in turn leads into further plot development. So an example in the Maidens is these postcards that the killer sends to his victims with ancient Greek, taunting them with ancient Greek quotations about human sacrifice. And that came to me through this process of trying to find a prop to demonstrate, that they are being targeted. Instead of doing it through dialogue, I thought, okay, I need a prop somehow to do it. And then the postcards came to me, but then that feeds into the novel itself and so on. I don't know how other writers write, so it's quite a shock to hear that people don't know where they're going. I wouldn't know how to do that. I would be too paralyzed by fear. I think a lot of it comes down to fear management, and I have a massive amount of anxiety about my writing. And so I think if I were to try and write something and not know where I was going, I think I would be too scared and inhibited to progress with it. But yeah, sure. I think giving yourself a really solid outline, it doesn't mean that I'm not surprised, and doesn't mean that things don't change during the writing process, and they do. But on the whole, the movement remains the same. The Maidens was more fluid than the Silent Patient. The Silent Patient, I was walking on Hampstead Heath and had an idea for a book, and then sat down and wrote the whole thing from start to finish on my phone, and I still have it. And nothing changed. But with the Maidens, I definitely, because it was a much bigger novel with a bigger canvas and more characters, it definitely changed a lot more. But even so, allowing myself to plan that kind of meticulously does do exactly what you're saying. It allows you to then really focus about in on the scenes and the language, and I really enjoy writing sentences, and moving words around and trying to make it a visual and sensory experience. All of that stuff, I find that the most important thing that I ever learned as a screenplay writer is that you can't do everything at once. And I meet people again and again and again, as I'm sure you talk to people too, who think because they've done one draft or whatever that it's finished, or two drafts and they can't do any better and it's kind of done, or they try and do everything in one draft and then get inhibited. I don't think it works like that. I think it's much more like painting, so you start with the basic brushstrokes, and then the next time you add more detail, and the next time you add more detail, and you go deeper. Billy Wilder said that the point of each rewrite and each draft is to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the thing. And so that's what I tend to do.
Now, the start of your prologue really is quite something. So Edward Fosker was a murderer. This was a fact. And then it goes on to say Edward Fosker was guilty. Now, you've just said that's not giving anything away. I mean, it's the first line. And you've just said that there are twists and turns on the way because that's how you write. But what was it like when you came upon that way to start a story, to immediately get into it? Like, this is what it's about. It's about a murder. And here's going to be one of our, the bloke we're going to assume has done it for a long time.
Well, a lot of it's about just, from a practical level, you don't want to bore people. And so I want to try and get on with it. It's funny you said that, because something that somebody said to me once was really true, is that I have a first act problem. And I really think I do have a first act problem, in that it's twice as long as it should be. And so part of that is a desperate attempt to try and get the story moving faster. But also, to be brutally honest, I stole it pretty much from Ruth Rendell. Has been a massive influence on me. And one of my favorite novels is called A Judgment and Stone. And the first line of that novel is, Eunice Parchman killed the Coverdale family because she could not read or write. And it's a really audacious way to start a book. And it's quite bold and devastating too. And immediately it conjures up a whole other level of suspense. You just think, okay, well, what happened then? And so it's just a technique I thought was really startling and fresh. And so I borrowed it.
No, and then, I mean, with the Ruth Rendell one, it kind of, the question is then, well, what is the suspense? Like, why am I reading it? Like, most of the time you're reading it to find out the killer, but if you know the killer, okay, so why are you trying to hook me in? Now, listen, you've been quite wonderfully self-analytical, so I'm gonna inquire just one more thing from that thread. The Silent Patient being the first ever UK debut novel to go straight to the number one. It's huge in America, it's been huge everywhere. I guess the question is, when you're writing in a genre where there are quite a lot of thrillers on the shelves, why do you think yours has stood out to such a degree?
That's an interesting question. It's a tough question. I'm probably not best placed to answer it. I don't. All I know is that my experience has been from people around the world who get in touch with me and they've read it, is that a very common refrain is, I don't read thrillers, but I read your book and I really enjoyed it. And I think because I was trying to, right from the outset, marry a Christie-style plot with a deeper emotional, psychological sensibility. And so all of my thoughts about therapy went into the novel. And all my beliefs about childhood trauma and all these other stuff. And so I think it works on different levels. I think people who, you could just read it for a thriller and enjoy that plot, or you could read it as something possibly a little bit deeper and enjoy that too. And I think maybe that's what it is. So those are the kind of books I like to read. I like to read rich books that have a lot going on, not just a plot, because I think a lot of modern thrillers there's some really great ones out there, but a lot of them are just a bit, like a takeaway burger. They're just like, you devour it really fast and you're left feeling slightly sick and slightly empty. And so I don't like to read books like that, and I certainly don't want to write them.
And lastly, and this is a bit of a standard question, but a lot of the listeners to the show are writers, but can't kind of catch that break to get their book out there. And you, having come back to London, working in Hollywood, doing screenwriting, then not having an agent, how did the process of getting The Silent Patient go for you?
It was wonderful. I mean, I honestly can't tell you the amount of times in my life, the amount of rejections I've had have just been so brutal and so endless for screenplays. And so I didn't expect it to be any different. And I was fortunate in that I just, again, it was, I don't know if it's fate or luck or what it was, but I looked online trying to find an agency that would accept unsolicited manuscripts. And there are very few, far between. But fortunately, I think one of the best agencies is the one I'm at, which is Rogers, Coleridge and White. And they do accept, not all agents there, but a couple of them. And I wrote to one of the agents there called Sam, who ended up becoming my agent and a really good friend now. And I just said, look, this is my situation. I'm a screenwriter. I've written a novel. It's a kind of detective story. Would you consider having a look at it? And he wrote back the next day saying, sure, send me 3 chapters and I'll have a quick look. And then and then a day later he said, why don't you send me the whole thing? I enjoyed the first 3 chapters. And so I did. And then within a week I'd signed for him and we were selling it. So it was such a dream, and it was the most wonderful experience of my life. And after all of those years of everything going wrong, it was just so blissful. But I know it's not like that for everybody. But I do think that's the way you need to do it. I think you just need to target somebody and just write to them and be honest.
And that is it for this week's Writer's Routine. Thank you so much to Alex Michaelides for coming on the show. You can get a copy of his book over at writersroutine.com by using the link in the episode notes as well. Now, yes, as I said, I'm having a few weeks off. I'll be back with a brand new episode and author for you on the 30th of September, all being well. In that time, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do that on Twitter at WritersPod, by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. Only takes a second, goes a long way. And by getting in touch at writersroutine.com. And you can always support us at patreon.com/writersroutine. Until then, until the 30th of September, I'll see you soon. Bye.